The Biden administration is currently working on writing the 2022 National Defense Strategy. That strategy should face challenges from adversaries like China, Russia, North Korea, and the Taliban, as well as the ramifications of rapidly expanding global threats. Bryan Clark is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He's former special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations. Bryan, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me on.
So how do you think this strategy should prioritize threats, given that there are so many?
Well, it's clear that China probably poses the biggest national security threat to the United States right now, mostly by our allies. Our allies in Japan and in the Philippines and in Taiwan all face threats coming from China, and they're going to have to address those in concert with U.S. forces. So that's probably the biggest challenge the U.S. is facing from a national security standpoint. There are others that the strategy will have to address, for example, Russia and its threats to our Eastern European allies, and also the threats posed by Iran, non-state terrorist actors, and also climate change. There's an aspect of that has to be addressed as well in terms of how do we think about how we design our military forces.
You mentioned China being the biggest national security threat and also Russia. I'm curious to see is it possible that those two could ally against us?
There's been some talk of that, and there have been some exercises recently where Chinese and Russian forces have operated together, both in Europe and mostly in the Western Pacific, where there is, of course, Russia has a presence in the Western Pacific as well. That alliance seems more, sort of an alliance of convenience. So when opportunities present themselves, they'll ally with each other or operate with each other as a way to show maybe the potential solidarity they would have. It's unlikely that they would actually join forces in a context of an armed conflict, though. They more likely have their own interests to pursue.
So how does U.S. military growth and modernization compare with that of China?
Well, the U.S. military is still, overall, more capable and larger in some ways than the Chinese military. But I think one thing that people have to sort of digest is the fact that the Chinese armed forces are actually the biggest armed forces in the world in most dimensions. So they have the largest ground force, the largest Navy, largest Coast Guard, largest maritime militia. They have the biggest Air Force in at least Asia. So in a lot of ways, they are the largest military in the world, even though the U.S. might be more capable and have a larger proportion of high-end forces within its military. The other challenge the U.S. faces is that China is able to focus all of its armed forces on the Western Pacific and its potential confrontations there, whereas the U.S. has to deal with its global responsibilities.
You say in your article, quote, after Homeland Defense, deterring aggression by China and Russia is arguably the most important strategic objective for the strategy to address. How should the DoD go about doing that?
Well, the DoD is going to have to face this kind of challenge that they have now of dealing with a pure competitor. So we really can't deter China in the same way that we deterred or tried to deter countries like Iraq or Iran or even North Korea, where we can show them that we could actually prevent them from being successful, what we call denying them their opportunity for aggression, and show them that we just stop them because that would make them stop thinking about aggression. Instead, we have to think about how do we steer China away from aggression as a tool for achieving their objectives, because if China really wanted to take Taiwan probably within the next 5 or 6 years, they'd be able to do it, just by virtue of the mass and the proximity that they have to Taiwan. So we got to think about other ways to deter, which would involve a combination of increasing the costs of aggression, both in terms of their military forces they might lose, and also the money and time they may spend on it. And then also reduce the benefits of aggression. So show that there's going to be an allied response to it that is not just military, but incurs other dimensions as well. So there's economic repercussions, there's political and diplomatic repercussions. So raise the costs, or reduce the benefits is probably the approach the U.S. is going to have to take, which is how we approached this in the Cold War with the Soviets.
You recommend that the U.S. military establish a strengthened forward defense posture in the Indo-Pacific. Right. What does that mean, and why is it necessary?
Well, to raise the cost of aggression and make it more uncertain for the Chinese that they would be successful against a country like Taiwan or the Philippines or Japan, you have to have a forward defense. You have to have forces there because China has such close proximity to these potential targets that you've got to be there in order to rapidly intervene. Otherwise, if it takes weeks for U.S. forces to flow into theater, they're not going to be able to form a very credible deterrent or contribution to the fight. So you've got to be there to be a contributor. That involves not just posture, posture of forces keeping them forward and maintaining them forward. It also means you got to have the training capabilities up forward. You have to have the pre-positioned stocks of supplies and weapons. And these are things that the Indo-Pacific commander has argued for both Admiral Davidson and now Admiral Aquilino.
And what about defense research, development, and acquisition? Do you have recommendations how to improve those?
Yeah, so clearly the U.S. needs to think about these new approaches to deterring aggression, which is about creating more uncertainty for China about their success, creating more options or adaptability in the U.S. force so that it improves that uncertainty for the Chinese. So you got to think about, and this is what the military is doing with the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, is trying to create a force that is more adaptable, more able to combine different forces in different force packages, different looks, different presentations than maybe we've seen in the past, that create the opportunity for commanders to be able to flexibly address what China might do and create more uncertainty for China how they might be able to succeed. So it's a lot about networking and creating more interoperability.
And Bryan, briefly, what are you most interested to see in the 2022 National Defense Strategy?
I'm most interested to see how the DoD addresses this challenge that China is a pure competitor, and we can't take the same approach to them as we took with Iran and some other regional competitors of the past. We really have to go back to that Cold War playbook and think about what are the things we can do to dissuade China from pursuing aggression, rather than trying to suggest that we're going to be able to stop them no matter what, because it's just a very hard thing to do when you're the away team as the United States and they're the home team as the Chinese.
All right, well, Bryan, we'll wait for that strategy to come out. Thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you. It was great being on.